Okay, welcome everyone to our May meeting of our virtual Hebrew reading group. We are very pleased to welcome Emmylou Grosser to take us through Judges 5, Deborah's song. This is a passage that I have been teasing Christoph about for months, saying, Christoph, if we're serious about reading non-narrative Hebrew, why not read one of the oldest passages? Surely you should start with the oldest passage in the book and work your way to the newer. So we're very pleased to have you with us, Emmylou, because it's our impression that this passage is really hard to understand. And so we're glad that you're here to guide us through it. Now, Emmylou is a researcher with the University of the Free State in South Africa. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Yes. And I just want to draw everyone's attention to her forthcoming book, Unparalleled Poetry. I think you can see my screen here, coming out on Oxford University Press, due out later this year. Emmylou has very kindly shared a discount code with us where you get 30% off. So you can contact me and I will send that to you if you're interested in ordering that. Everybody needs to click this button right here, add to basket, and order it. I'm sure it's going to send ripples through the Hebrew community. And then, yeah, there's with the discount. And also, I see you have a somewhat recent article here on poetic effects in the Song of Deborah. So I can't think of a better guide to take us through this.
And if you need that article, I can send it to you in a PDF. I just couldn't post it on academia.
Right. Excellent. So if anybody wants to nerd out a bit more on what we're going to cover today, you know who to get in touch with. Great. Okay, so our goal today is to get as far as we can through Judges 5, explore this, appreciate it in a new way. Emmylou, set us up. What do we need to know as we jump in here?
Okay. Well, first, I just want to say hello, everybody. And this is such a privilege for me to be reading Judges 5 with you all. And I've been exploring lately how my work, I think, can be of value for translators. And so this is, I've spoken with some translators recently, and I know you have a really hard job. And I just want to say, if I'm too nerdy, if I'm too academic and I'm not scratching the itch of what you want, just say something, and I'll try to shift. So, because I don't know my audience super well at this point, and so I'm going to do my best, and just also feel free to carry on the conversation with me later. You can get my contact information, and I would just, I'd love to hear from you. What's helpful, what's not helpful, what you'd like to know more about. Okay, so Judges 5 is, I think it's a great poem, a great song. It's artfully done, but it does have some challenges in it, and some of these challenges are related to what does this word mean, which, the verse 2, we could spend a whole hour or a whole week talking about what that means. So today I don't want to get hung up on what does this particular word mean necessarily. But I'd love to focus on what is a poetic line and why does it matter? Does it matter if we know what the poetic lines are, and what are they? And then that goes into larger shapes of poetry, and speaking of lines and line groupings, and then what I speak of as figures, how line groupings come together to create these shapes and poems. And so my work is coming out of cognitive poetics research, and so it's coming through literary studies, and it's also coming through how cognitive meaning in the neurosciences and psychology, and how that intersects with the arts. So I'm super comfortable using metaphors of visual art. I'm also super comfortable exploring metaphors of music, and how shapes unfold in music. And after all, this is a song. So, but within that context, we also have words. And that's what's unique about poetry, is we have art and we have shapes and we have arranged messages out of words. And it's those words that really carry forward, or words and how they're combined and lots of different grammatical constructions, how they create these shapes. So that's my starting place. I think what's before we jump into the translation, I guess what I speak about in my book, and also that symmetry article on Judges 5, goodness, I wrote it like 5 years ago, and it didn't, no, 6 years ago, and it didn't get published until a couple years after I wrote it, which is the lag time. And by that time, I had already nuanced some things. So it was old when it came out, which is just the nature of things. But all of that information from that article is included in my book, and I nuance it further, and there are some of the things that I talk about. My basic approach to the biblical Hebrew poetic line, it's supposed to be cross-linguistic, except that you all have much more access to poetries of the world than I do. I've had to spend a lot of time just reading what academics say about poetries of the world. And so the basic idea, this cognitive idea, is that these lines are meant to be heard. They're aural, A-U-R-A-L, units. They're not visual units. And so they're also meant to be heard in relation to each other. So I can contrast English meter here, which has a pattern for the line, and the line needs to be heard or organized in relationship to that pattern to be heard as a line. So biblical poetry does not work that way. It doesn't have a metrical template for how to hear the line. It doesn't use end rhyme, which works really well with meter because it helps you hear where lines end. And we can't focus on line ends to hear biblical poetry because they aren't end marked. Now they might have been end marked in performance, and that's a whole nother story, but we don't have access to that with a disclaimer about the Masoretic cantillation, which we can talk about in a sec. So this idea that the line has to be heard, not because you see it on a page, not because it has to be organized in relation to a metrical template, but that lines have to, in Robert Lowe's language, have to conform to each other, or we can say lines have to be heard in relation to each other. So it's relatively free, except that not just anything goes. And this is the same thing that we do all the time in our perception of the world around us, is we have to organize things based on how they emerge in relationship to each other. And this is where the Gestalt principles of perception come in, that we have cognitive tools that are so normal to us, we don't even think about it. But when we mentally organize all the stimuli that we see or that we hear, we organize them. And because we're human, and because we have the same strategies for organizing these perceptual stimuli, we're fairly confident that even though I can't get inside your brain, that we're somehow similarly looking at the world. Like, we can't say that for sure, but based on these Gestalt experiments that have been done, I can fairly confidently say that when you look at the screen and you see me, you do see a person that's a figure, and that you see those books in the background. I mean, so we subjectively experience the world, but we also have common ways of experiencing it as humans because of how our brains are wired to process data and to process patterns. So with that in mind, this idea of part-whole processing is how the Gestalt theorists talk about it, that we don't add up the parts to make the wholes, but that the nature of the parts influences the whole, and the nature of the whole influences the parts. And so that basic idea that in biblical poetry, lines are parts of line groupings is essential to the versification system. If you don't hear line groupings, you can't hear lines, because that's how part-whole perceptual processing works. And so that's a key idea, is that we can't just lineate a poem. We have to actually hear lines in relation to line groupings. And so I avoid parallelism, there's a lot of reasons for that. It brings a lot of baggage into the discussion that I don't think is helpful. But that's the book. You can read that if you want to. So this idea that we're listening for lines and we're listening for them, how they're organized language within the context of a line grouping, and that line groupings have integrity. So you can hear that a line belongs in a line grouping and not in another one. And the patterning of the whole determines what the part is, but the nature of the parts affects the whole. So it goes both ways. And it sounds super complicated, and it is, except that, like I said, humans do this all the time. This is how we see, this is how we hear. And so we can't just say it's a free-for-all. So the next thing then to add on to that is that these line groupings come together to form figures. And so if we don't hear the line groupings and how they're shaped in relationship to each other to form these larger figures of poetry, we can't experience the poetry. Now, I don't know what that means for translators, because, I mean, it seems to me like you have to understand the figures to be able then to come towards a poetic translation. And it's not just the form that matters, it's actually, it affects interpretation and it affects the message of the poem to hear how these figures come together. So some of you, let's see. Yeah, so some of you, I don't know how many of you get into the Masoretic accents or cantillation. Is that something people are interested in? Because I can say a word on that, or I can skip it. Thoughts, Drew?
For some of us, it's a bit beyond our level, and that's probably because it's been skipped over in many of the introductory courses that we've had to Biblical Hebrew. It's unfortunate, but for our purposes for this reading group, we often, I don't know, for better or worse, probably for worse, we often kind of don't pay much attention. I don't know. What do you want to say, Christoph?
We don't know much. Most of us, we know that Atnach and that Silux of Pasuk has some function, but if it goes beyond that, then most of us will probably not know much.
Okay, so I'll just say a quick thing about that. Some of you know Sophia Pitcher. I know Drew knows Sophia. She's amazing. She's got some incredible work going on, some incredible research in this very topic. And she wanted to be here. That's why it's being recorded. So we are sort of in a stage of research where we're having these conversations about how the poetic line relates to the Masoretic cantillation or accent marks. The basic thing I want to say about that is that her work is arguing for a thoroughly linguistic, prosodic, phonological account of the Masoretic accents, and it's really good work. And that goes against what is often assumed about the accents, that you can somehow just use them in a simplistic way, and then it gives you the poetic lines. So she and I would take the position that that doesn't work, because that's not what they were meant to do. In the same way that if you're reading English poetry, there are many ways to perform a poem and how you articulate the ends of the lines, and different performers will do that differently in their intonation, in their pauses, in their spacing. And that's part of the art of communicating the poetry. And it's related to the line, but you can't just simply just use it and it gives you the lines. So that's sort of the short answer, in case some of you are wondering, like, wait, she just blew right over one of those major accents. Why did she do that? That's a long discussion, and it's super fascinating. And there are some things in this poem that I'm going to have to work out with Sophia. But yeah, that's the short answer. Okay, so that was a long introduction. I'm going to let you guys just start. And so that verse 2, that first line of the poem, we can consider that a line grouping, and I would call that a figure as well. So if somebody wants to read that and translate, that would be great.
Are we going to read verse 1? Would it be
Sure,
bad?
go for it.
Would it be bad if we read verse 1?
That's great. Go for it.
Okay. Do we have a volunteer for reading verse 1?
Yeah, I would like to.
Okay, go for it, Rija.
Watasha Dawora Warach ben Avinoam Bayom Hahu Lemor.
And would you like to give us a translation of it, Rija?
No, I forgot actually Watashar. Can you do for me?
Tashar kind of looks like a verb. To sing. The verb to sing. Sang Deborah and Barak, son of Avinoam, on that day, saying, yeah, okay. And then let's just jump right into verse 2. Thank you, Rija. Do we have, if there are no comments on verse 1, shall we just have a volunteer for reading verse 2?
One may just say that's the ending of the non-poetic text. That's the frame of the narrative, which marks the start with Lemor as a different genre starting.
Very good. Yep. Volunteer for verse 2.
Drew, that's hard stuff. I can do verse 2.
Go for it, Christoph.
Bifroa v'ra'ot b'Israel v'hitnadev am baruchu Adonai. And the second part seems easier for the meaning. The first part is a little bit hard. It's generally understood by open the hair, which is generally understood that the warriors had long hair and opened it for going to war. But that is just an assumption. When by opening the open hair in Israel in doing volunteer free will things, if when the people did free will things, bless or praise the Lord.
Good. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, that is a hard one. Nothing like starting out a song with nothing that modern people know what it means. But that's a good approximation, and we're just going to go with that. So the thing that I want to point out poetically about this line grouping, I'm going to read it, and I want us to just listen to what the parts are. Okay. Bifroa Puramo Yisrael, Hithnadev Gam, Baruchu Adonai. Sometimes, I hope this isn't offensive, sometimes I slip into Yahweh's just because I'm trying to recapture the phonemes that would have, yeah. So I'm not trying to be offensive when I do that. Just because it sounds a lot different than Adonai, and it's 2 syllables and not 3. So as we hear this, I think, again, setting aside the language of parallelism, when we hear it, Bifroach Paraoth Yisrael, Bahithnadev Gam, you hear this similarity in structures. But what I want to point out is that second piece, there's like 3 parts there. Bifroach Paraoth Yisrael, Bahithnadev Gam, Baruch Hu Adonai. That second piece, Bahithnadev Gam, it's similar to the first, but it's not symmetrical. And when I use symmetry, what I mean by symmetry is that it's a similarity of both the components and their place in a line grouping. And the cool thing about symmetry is that it creates these closed shapes, and it's not just repetition. It's not just a continuous ABC, ABC, ABC kind of patterning. Because the line grouping is a whole, if you have symmetry, it can feel closed as long as all the other pieces are closed too. Now, in this case, could we? This is a little bit of a no. Let's not do that. So to talk about symmetry in this way, we don't have this similar kind of thing in English poetry because we don't arrange our lines in part-whole groupings. It's sort of like when you see a face, you don't expect more eyes and mouths on it because you know that that's the whole, that it's symmetrical and it's closed. When you see a tree and you see the symmetry, you know that it's whole and it's closed. And so biblical poetry has this pretty neat thing because everything is arranged in lines and line groupings. It can create a symmetry of two lines that are symmetrically arranged that's actually a whole, and it can feel complete. It can feel closed. Now here, these lines they start in a similar way, but it doesn't turn out to be symmetrical. So it doesn't close, okay? It's grammatical because you have these, however we want to translate it, when the hair hangs loose in Israel, when the people volunteer, it's grammatically incomplete, but it's also imbalanced. And what I've noticed is whenever components of contiguous lines are arranged symmetrically, but they're not balanced, it's actually intentional. I mean, I would say it's part of the artistry. So it's supposed to feel as if it's not closed, okay? And so because these aren't, because they're similar, but yet they're not truly symmetrical, it doesn't finish, the second line doesn't finish in a symmetrical way. It creates the expectation for more, but it doesn't create the expectation for a symmetrical line pair followed by another symmetrical line pair. For example, like an AABB pattern, which I don't know if you guys, probably nobody's into like O'Connor's like syntactic stuff, but he has a special name for that. So, so what you have here is an integrated line triple, 3 lines, 3 parts to a whole, and it's not all balanced and tidy. We're going to get to some balanced, tidy ones soon, but it is integrated, and it comes to a certain kind of closure, but it's not a super stable shape, if that makes sense. We'll get to some very stable shapes. So just sort of tuck that away. It's integrated. You can hear it as a shape that's interesting, but it also just sort of, it leads to more. It has this feeling of it's going somewhere, and you should definitely expect more of this poem. So it works well as, you know, an introduction to what's going on. All right, so let's, if there's not questions, we can go on to the next figure, and this would be all of verse 3. But it's not just a couple, it's 6 lines, but yeah, I'll let somebody go ahead and translate that.
Okay. Yep, I suspect that things will become clear. It's a lot to take in, but so good. I suspect things will become clearer as we move along. Unless anybody has a really, really pressing question or observation here at verse 2, I propose we kind of move on to verse 2.
Right. Nothing like demonstrating a really complex idea on the hardest verse in the song.
So if you have a question at this juncture, please just keep it in your mind, and then if it's not resolved after verse 3, maybe you can bring it up. Rob, you got something that's really pressing, or can you hang on to it till verse 3? Is that fair for everybody? Christoph, you think that's good? Hang on to questions until end of verse 3. Okay, shall we do that?
That's fine.
I hope we won't frustrate or lose anyone. We'll see. All right. Do we have Rob? Are you raising your hand to read verse 3 for us?
No, I didn't, but I can go ahead and try. I'm not a very fluent reader.
Hey, that's okay. We're all here because we want to improve and practice. So no worries. Thank you, Rob. Go for it.
Okay. Shim'u, Malachim, Zinu, Roznim, Anochi, La'Adonai, Anochi, Asherah, Azamer, La'Adonai, Elohei, Yisrael.
Thank
So
you.
hear kings, give or attune your ears, rulers, I to Adonai or Yahweh. I will sing praises to Adonai or Yahweh, the God of Israel.
Thank you. Well done, Rob.
Yeah. Drew, why don't we pull up the other sheet there? Yeah. All right, so this is breaking it into a figure. And this is what I mean by a figure. It's 3 line pairs that come together, and it has a meaningful shape. Okay, so it says, you can, pull up the translation too. That might be helpful for people, since we've already translated it.
I'm afraid it might end up being too small. Can people? Can you make it out?
Yep.
All right. All right, so here we have Shemu Malachim, hear kings, Hachzinu Rosanim, give ear rulers. Now there's a perfect example of symmetry. That it's symmetrical in lots of ways. The words are the components and they match up grammatically, they match up in meaning, similarity in meaning, and what it creates there is a whole, right? The kings and the rulers are probably the same here. I don't think it's trying to identify 2 different groups. It can, Hebrew poetry can do that in these symmetrical line pairs, but here I think there's overlap. It's 2 parts of a whole, and it's symmetrical, and it's a closed shape. And so when you hear it, Shemu Malachim, Hachzinu Rosanim, it's very standard biblical poetry way of creating a line pair, saying 2 parts but 1 whole, and that's pretty standard. It goes on then to the next line pair, Anoki Ladonai, Anoki Ashira, and here you have a gap in the first line, and so you get it filled out by the second line. So I to Yahweh, I will sing, and there you have something, they're symmetrically arranged, but because of this thing called ellipsis, there's something fragmented in the surface structure. And so this is kind of neat because it binds the 2 lines together, but it lets it land on the last word. So it moves somewhere. Okay, let me see if I can try to say this. So the first line pair, 3A, is somewhat static because it's symmetrical and it's closed and it's stable. The second one kind of moves towards that Ashira and it lands on it because it's required. You need it. Anoki Ladonai, Anoki Ashira, that I to Yahweh, I will sing. So you can hear how it moves differently. So this is part of the art of poetry, that it's moving somewhere. And then in the third line pair, Zamer Ladonai Elohei Yisrael. This one is not symmetrical, but it's definitely moving somewhere. It's a continuation. The God of Israel is who Yahweh is. It's in apposition. And so this whole figure, it starts with a stable line pair, stability. It goes into another line pair that's moving forward. And then this other line pair is different. It's not symmetrical, and it brings closure to this figure. So we could talk about the patterning here, and the different ways that this whole shape is integrated, which would be interesting, but just for the sake of time, let's go on to the next one, because this one is also super interesting. And yeah, so unless people have questions on that second figure, which I'm happy to talk about more.
I think we're going to have some questions. I just want to understand that what you're calling a figure. Can you all see the colors that I've put on the screen? So, yeah, is the purple what you're calling a figure?
Yes, the purple is what I'm calling a figure.
Okay.
Yeah. And
All
that
right.
just means it's a shape that goes beyond. I mean, it's a shape that goes beyond what just the line grouping does. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes, perfect sense. Yeah, and I think we had a question here. Sorry, I think I unmuted and then muted. Brian, yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Okay. Yeah, a question, Emmylou, please. Is there a link between lines 4 and 5 though, with parallel of sing and make melody, or can we not? Or can we not come out of the 2-2-2?
Absolutely, and that's how they're integrated. So we can talk about the patterning here, and what you see there is that so you see the repetition of Ladonai in the third line. Wait, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, the third line and the fifth line, which creates a certain kind of pattern. And then you also see that repetition, or not repetition, but that patterning of Shira and Zamer. So I will sing and I will make melody. And so that contributes to an integration of those two lines. And the thing about this is that the patterning is actually a lot easier to hear than it is to describe. And so one way, yeah, I write this long description in my book about this particular figure and how the patterning goes. And again, it's just I'm trying to think of a quick way to talk about how it's heard. So because it has a symmetrical line pair to begin, and then a symmetrical line pair in the second line, and the third line then is not symmetrical, you have a change. Often change of a pattern can affect closure. And I think you can actually hear this, how it says, "Hear, kings, give ear, O rulers. I to Yahweh, I will sing. I will make melody to Yahweh, the God of Israel." Do you hear how that change in the patterning and how the lines are symmetrical, and then less symmetrical? It's a continuation, and how change in patterning can often it can bring closure to a figure. So it actually sounds like the figure has reached a completion, and that the figure you don't necessarily expect it to keep going. However, if you hear just the first 4 lines, it still feels like it's going somewhere. It still feels like it has more to say. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. These patterns that are interlinking, and that's why I call this a figure, because it is integrated. A figure has integration, and there are things about the lines that connect them to each other so that you are supposed to hear them as all related to each other. And so a lot of there's this principle of continuation that is a Gestalt principle, and continuation is the way we hear things in relation to each other, or the way we'll see things as continuous, even if there's a break. So we have, like in music, we can hear a continuous melody across a whole piece, even if there's breaks in it. We can hear a continuous rhythmic pattern, and so our minds can like do incredible things with patterns and hearing continuity at different levels, all at the same time. These discrete continuations, but yet we are also limited by the organization of the whole. It's not just chaos that we're hearing and we're just picking out patterns. It's the way it's all shaped that allows us to hear those continuations and those patterns. So yeah, do you have any follow-up questions on that as far as the patterning that's heard?
Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Okay, so going back up to verse 2 then,
Mhm.
what kind of groupings and do we have there for what you're calling line groupings?
Yeah, so I would just call those 3 lines together a line grouping or a line triple. And they are I would just call it a figure as well, since it belongs together and it's doing something discrete in the poem. And then later in this poem, which is in verse 9, we get another 3-line figure that's very similar to this one. And when we get to that figure, it's reminiscent of this figure. And we're supposed to recall that first figure of the poem when we hear a similar thing in verse 9.
Okay, and what you are calling figures, is that generally synonymous with verses?
Yeah, so not necessarily. It can be. Sometimes they are, as we'll see in the next one. 2 verses, verses 4 and 5, together make a figure. So figures can go farther than that. The way I would view the Masoretic verse, and this again fits in with Sophia Pitcher's view of the accents, is that it's an utterance. It's a pragmatic utterance, and it is related to the poetic structure, but you can't just simply map it on to the poetic structure.
Okay, thank you.
Anne, did you have a comment or question, Anne?
Well, I'm just thinking about how I've analyzed poetry. So do you want to go up to verse 3 again?
Yep.
Yeah. So you don't want to talk about parallelisms, or I'm not sure how I'm fitting in how I've analyzed it and what you're talking about.
Yeah, so I think one of the drawbacks of parallelism is like what does it really mean? And that's sort of tricky because we could say, and I mean, I guess I can ask you too, like what do people mean by parallelism? Because it means so many different things. And if we look at verses, the first 2 lines of verse 3 and the second 2 lines of verse 3, we could say that both of those are parallel. And we could even say through ellipsis that they both have a kind of grammatical parallelism. The reason why I'm moving away from parallelism, it's longer, but the simple reason is because it focuses on similarities and differences typically, rather than describing the gestalt shapes or that a poem or a figure can take.
Sorry, I don't understand the word gestalt. You're gonna have to reword it.
Okay. So so when I say that, let me try to describe like sort of the difference between those 2 line pairs according to their shapes. So I talked about how 3A and B can have they're symmetrical, and so they have a stability that comes from that. They're a closed shape, they're symmetrical, and they're a very stable shape. The next 2 lines, C and D, we can view those in a sense as symmetrical, which means it's closed. But because it's less symmetrical, we can talk about partial symmetry. So it's hard to say less parallel. It just, like, what does that mean? Like, it's either parallel or it's not parallel. But if we use the idea of symmetry, we can say, yeah, it's symmetrical. There's a missing verb there. It's elided, and so there's a symmetry of the grammar that poetic shape relies upon. But at the same time, there's movement within that line pair. It's that movement piece that poetry has that I don't think parallelism can capture. And so when you say, I to Yahweh, I will sing, it's moving towards I will sing. And so if we want to use the word equilibrium, symmetry has a strong equilibrium, and you can mess with it and you can weaken that equilibrium. But in this particular passage, because it fragments the surface structure, like the words that are actually there because of the ellipsis, it changes that that equilibrium that you can have in a symmetry, and it adds a movement within the lines. So does that help? So parallelism, it just doesn't give us the tools that we need to talk about the poetry as verbal art, and how the shapes emerge, and how poetry can move, and then how it can make us feel certain things. So a stable shape feels very different from a moving shape. And I want to make sure that we get to 4 and 5 to contrast that with verse 6, because that will demonstrate that very point, this idea of stability versus instability, and a different kind of feeling that it can generate in the person who's experiencing the poem.
Well, I definitely agree that parallelism is not the only thing you need to look at to analyze a poetic text. And you need to know the you need to follow the discourse. Well, we use that term discourse structure, yeah, and how it moves forward from one to the next. So okay, so I think maybe we are seeing some of the same things, but maybe using different language. I'm not sure, but I'm going to listen to you for the rest of it.
Yeah, and it's, I don't want to just get caught up in terminology either, because a lot of the things that people are observing in parallelism, like, can we come up with a simpler framework, is really what we're trying to do, like a simpler framework to describe what people are noticing. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Ron, did you have,
Yeah, I know you want to go on to verse 4 and 5. Quick question. Emmylou, could this be early parallelism, or is that ruled out in your research? Could this be, because it's so ancient poetry, could this be a sort of early form that then developed into parallelism later in the Hebrew Bible? Or is that not an option?
Well, I think what I'm trying to do in my work is to present a model of lines and line groupings that describes how this versification system, how it works, that fits across the times, because the versification system didn't change. How people are cognitively organizing the lines, that didn't change. Okay, later Hebrew poetry became metrical, and then that cognitive organization did change. But so what I'm going for is trying to come up with a model that works, and we can talk about what line forms were conventional at different stages of history, and what conventions were used. But even more basic than that is what is this versification system? And it's that simple idea of lines fit to each other somehow. So does that make sense? That's not an unimportant question, but it sort of fits into this question, or this issue of just the framework that we could use to describe how things change.
Thanks.
Yeah.
No, really good.
If people, like, we could just talk about these lines for the sake of time. I know this is a reading group, and so I feel bad sabotaging your practice reading, which is super important. I'm just afraid we won't get through, and I'm afraid we won't get to this main point before the time's up. Is that okay?
Yeah. Right. What do you want to do? Yeah.
Let's go to the other document there. And so let's do verses 4 and 5. And this is an example of symmetry that gets bigger than a line pair. Okay, so you guys probably remember David's lament when I'll just read it to you from the English. Don't tell it in Gath, don't proclaim it in the streets of Ashkelon. lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. So what you have is a symmetrical line pair, followed by another symmetrical line pair. They're grammatically related to each other, and it's a way of connecting two symmetrical line pairs. So you have 4 line pairs, A, B, B, and it sounds like, you know, a closed shape. Okay, so this borrows that same principle of building a symmetrical pattern, but it does something different, which is super cool. So Adonai b'tzeilecha miseir, b'tzaknadecha mislei alom. Okay, so these are, I'm going to say partially symmetrical because there's but nearly some, I mean, just a slight variation that Yahweh in the first line adds a slight like change to the symmetry, but we're going to hear this as symmetrical. Like it doesn't have to be perfectly symmetrical to hear a line pair as symmetrical. Okay, so these are grammatically incomplete. We expect the finishing of the sentence, right? The finishing of the clause. And so we get Eretz Rakasha, the earth shook. Did somebody have a question? Or, no, okay. Earth shook. And because it started with a symmetrical line pair, that often what you get is another symmetrical line pair in a stable figure to finish out that 4-line whole, okay? That's a pretty common pattern in, or we can even say almost a conventional pattern that you see in biblical poetry. So here we would expect to hear another symmetrical line pair to complete that symmetry. It started as a symmetrical pattern. We're going to expect a symmetrical pattern. But what we get is Eretz Rakasha, earth shook, Gam Shemayim Natafu, even the heavens dripped. And we can ask ourselves, does that sound done? And I would say, no, it doesn't, because there's a slight variation. You could hear it that way. Your mind could say, yeah, I can make it done. I can make that symmetrical. Eretz Rakasha and Gam Shemayim Natafu. I can make that a symmetrical line pair in my head if I really want to force it to, but it doesn't really give you that click of completion. It doesn't really give that to you. And so what it does instead, it goes Gam Gavim Natafu Mayim. Okay, now is that line, what's that, 4E, is that line more similar to 4D? It is. So we have 2 lines that are even more similar to each other than the other one. There's a stronger symmetry, we could say, between those 2 lines in their meaning, what the meaning and in the components, but there's a slight change. You have an extra word, water, and so what you hear is the pattern's not done yet. Something else is happening, and so you get then Harim Nazalu. Okay, the mountains quaked. Now you can look at I can explain the footnote there. For Nazalu, that could be either parsed as from the verb quake or from a different verb flow, and which is kind of neat here because flow relates more to the 2 preceding lines, whereas quaked relates more to 3 lines up, the earth shook. And so what you have here is lines Eretz Rakasha, earth shook, and 5A, Harim Nazalu, the mountains quaked. Those are actually symmetrically paired with each other. And so you have this pattern in the lines that started, we could say at the beginning of the verse, it goes A, then we get a B line. Yep, there's the A2. And then the third one is a B line. And then we can call the next 2 C lines. And then we get another B line. And what would we expect to complete that symmetry? We would expect 2 more A lines, 2 more lines that correspond with the first 2. And if you scroll down, that's exactly what we get. So Mipnei Adonai Zeh Sinai, Mipnei Adonai Elohei Yisrael. And so then you get this completed figure, and those are nicely symmetrical lines there, and they're strongly symmetrical. So it makes this clinch of closure. If you're listening for the pattern, like if you're listening for what pattern is emerging, if you're not trying to fit it to a metrical template, if you're listening for what pattern is emerging, those 2 lines give you that click of completion of an 8-line symmetrical whole. And that's where the figure, so because it closes so strongly as it finishes, the pattern is so strong, it's not fudging the symmetry in those last 2 lines. You can hear it, and you can look at how the lines are different lengths too. The longer lines are at the top, then they're also at the bottom, and the shorter lines are the ones that are around that central line pair. So you can hear it has balance as well. The whole figure has balance. The whole figure has symmetry. And when a symmetrical figure closes, when it clicks into place, like that missing piece clicks into place, you can experience it as closure. And these symmetrical figures that are strongly symmetrical, they have the potential to be stable, to have equilibrium, to be, and even they can like have a sense of certainty with them. And you can see how it matches the content as well. This is about Yahweh coming forth. He's coming forth in certainty. He's coming forth in stability. It's grandiose. And we have 5 more minutes, so we better go on to the next one. So that is in high contrast, the shapes of that figure and what's doing poetically is in major contrast to verse 6, where it says, B'mei Shamgar ben Ganat, B'mei Ya'el. Okay, it starts similarly, and it actually sets it up symmetrically, but it's not balanced. The second line falls short, okay? And so not symmetrical line pair, you're expecting more. Is it going to become a symmetrical line 4? Is it, well, how's it going to complete? So as you're listening for the poetry and these emerging shapes, you're asking, what's going to happen next? Hadalu or a ceased the ways. So that finishes your clause, but because you had this partially symmetrical opening, you kind of expect you're going to actually follow it up with a symmetrical line pair, because that's kind of conventional in Hebrew. And so we get, well, so ceased did ways, that doesn't complete it grammatically, and travelers of paths, but yet paths corresponds with the ways. And so it sounds like it's almost trying to be symmetrical, but it's not quite, and it's not done yet, like it's grammatically incomplete. And then we go on to the next line, traveled ways twisting. And so that one is, it corresponds to the line above it. It has halak and halak, the travelers. And it corresponds with orachoth, the ways correspond to the nativoth, the paths. But then you add this extra word of twisting. And so what you end up with is constantly thwarted symmetrical expectations. So there's correspondences from line to line, but the symmetrical expectations are consistently thwarted as it goes. It finally comes to, the sentence comes to an end in the last line, traveled ways twisting, and it also balances your first line, 6a. If you can hear that balance, how the long line at the beginning balances the long line at the end. But the shapes just constantly shift, and they're not certain shapes. They're constantly uncertain, and you can feel it as the poetry goes along. Uncertainty, uncertainty, uncertainty. And then it finally closes, and you can feel that the figure is closed because it comes to this balance, but it feels pretty unstable. It feels uncertain. And that's this huge contrast that's put in poetically between what's going on in Israel, how people are meandering on ways that are twisting. They are wandering all around because they're trying to escape their enemies, right? It's not safe on the roads. That's the bottom line. It's not safe on the roads, which is in total contrast to Yahweh coming from, entering into the land from Edom, and how he came grandiosely. And he entered the land, and he's strong and he's certain, and he takes the path that he wants to take. In contrast, you have the Israelites who are meandering all over the place because of their enemies, right? They're just scared and they can't even travel in the land. So the message, like you can hear that in the content, the people moving around is a lot different than Yahweh entering the land, but it's also in the shapes of the poetry. It's in the artistry of the poetry that you can actually feel it, because you're supposed to feel it in the movement of the shapes of poetry. You can feel what the text is trying to say. So that's the art of the poetry, and how symmetry is used, and then partial symmetry and not quite symmetry is used to do this kind of thing. Okay, all right, I got like 1 minute left. I hope that made a little bit of sense about where what I'm trying to do, like discussing artistically what is going on in poetry. All right, good. Who wants to ask something or wrap up or?
I was just going to say, in my mind, it's helpful to draw an analogy to music, how music can feel unresolved or resolved based on the note you start on, and the note you end up on. Sometimes you hear a
Yes.
song and you think, oh, it needed to, oh, you're waiting, it kind of builds, and then you wait, and then you think, oh, it needs to circle back around, the progression needs to circle back around. I don't know, that's helpful for me for understanding it.
Absolutely.
I'm just wondering how in the world does one bring these musical qualities, this resolution and this building and all that? How do you bring this suspension to translation? I mean, I'm thinking especially the languages I work with, often when you have ellipses, you sometimes have to supply the missing elements, right? For some languages, according to their politics or their translation, whatever. And maybe that's doing away with some of that. Maybe it's supposed to feel incomplete, right? And here we are completing it to kind of complete the sense, but maybe it's not supposed to feel complete. I don't know. So I'm just wondering what to do with that. Anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, it's totally fascinating. Is this written in your article?
Yes, it is in the article.
Excellent. We'll read. I'm a bit worried now because I'm actually doing a PhD with the University of the Free State
Oh,
on Judges 4 and 5, not in particular looking at the Hebrew. It's about translating this passage orally, and we've made an Altai epic song based on this. I can't believe I've only just heard about your work now, so I will, let's say, hasten to read it rather fast. But
yeah.
fascinating. Just can I ask? Do we have one more minute? In verse 4, would it be possible to move the dripped and the water dripped down a line to make it 10 lines, or does that go against kind of does that ruin the pattern? Does that not work? So could you go back to verse 4 there? Yeah. What if we move dripped, natafu and natafu maim? What if they were also separate lines and there were 10 lines, or is that not working?
Yeah, I think in the context of the whole, hearing those clauses as lines, it's possible to break a line mid-clause. Definitely, it happens a lot. I think that here, because Gam Shmaim and Gam Gavim, they start the lines similarly. Typically, if you hear the pattern start over again and you hear a similarity between two segments, you're going to hear they're going to emerge as two lines and not 4, if that makes sense, because they're simpler parts of the whole. I don't know if that goes back to the Gestalt language, which I go into detail in the book, but I think the simpler part whole rendering has each of those as a line.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent. I'm gonna stop the share. Yep. Any other comments or questions? I'm gonna stop